I have to say, someone recently likened 3 of the select committee members to the family members from that program, the Hillbillies. You've got Jethro, Simon Bridges, you've got Ali May over there with Nikki Kay, and you've got Jed Clampett with John Carter, and I just thought that was wonderful. I need to point out to Mr Bridges the arrogance that we experienced being on that select committee and having to endure the National Party and ACT members there was quite horrific, actually, Mr Chair. And I want to point out one of the snide remarks that were made. I think at one point there were 1,000 submissions, or near enough to 1,000 submissions. And I remember saying, you know, Simon Bridges, a lot of these submissions are against it. You've got to listen to them. And Mr Bridges said, well, there's 1,000 submissions against it, but all the people that didn't make submissions are obviously for it. Now, I don't actually think that's the case, Mr Bridges, but I do remember you clearly saying that. And the other thing that, Mr Bridges, that I have to point out, which came up over and over again, so many of the submissions were pro-Māori representation, were pro having Māori seats. So many people were pro having a strong Pacific voice, having a strong ethnic voice with regards to the submissions that came through. And I recall Mr Bridges quite clearly saying to a number of the submitters, well, if there's enough of you, why do you need special seats? Why can't those groups just get elected on their merit? Now, Mr Bridges seems to think that's possible because he's a Māori member for Tauranga. I just have to remind Mr Bridges there was someone else there that broke the ground for him, a Māori member before him in Tauranga, and that was Mr Winston Peters. A person I know Mr Bridges looks up to very much he looks up to Mr Winston Peters. So he didn't break the ground there. Mr Peters actually paved the way for Mr Bridges to be able to come through as a Māori Member of Parliament in Tauranga. So let's just remind Mr Bridges about that. He forgets that he stands on the shoulders of giants. He forgets that. Now, Mr Chair, I also want to point out, I wasn't a full-time member. I wasn't a full-time member on that select committee, but when I did sit in, I have to say there were times where I felt rather nauseous watching Miss Nikki Kay drool over the submitters when they came through, promising the world, like Mr Hawkins just said previously, telling them that she is listening to them, Mr Chair. I am on your side and I am listening. I am listening. And then what happens? What happens?
Nothing.
Did they get youth representation on the Auckland Super City? No. And how does she respond now? She says that they will have a voice of some sort, but they won't have the voice that they wanted. Well, if she is going to be the conduit for them, Mr Chair, then I'd be very concerned because she didn't represent them very well. I know, she's the renegade. She's the renegade of the National Party, but my goodness, that didn't work very well, did it, Mr Chair? Now, Mr Chair, Ms Namaia Mahuta brought it up before with regards to Māori, Pacific and ethnic representation. And our Pacific community have been upset that what they're looking at now is they're looking at the fact that it will be the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs that appoints their people to the Pacific Advisory Board. And effectively, Mr Chair, what they're seeing is they may as well be government appointees. It's a ministry that's appointing them. It's not them that actually has a voice with regards to selecting the candidates who they think is best fit for those positions, Mr Chair. But that government needs to have control over everything so much that they can't even hand over a small thing like that, allowing the Pacific community to actually decide who will represent them. On a small scale, they're not council seats, Mr Chair. It's an advisory board. But that one thing, that side of the House couldn't even give it to them. And I'd like to know from the Minister, what was the problem with that? With the current boards we have in place, they're elected. We just had elections recently for the Pacific people that will go on the Auckland City Pacific Board, even though it's only for a few months. They had a successful election. So what was the problem with that, Minister, with regards to allowing our communities to actually select them? Are you so concerned, Minister, that they might choose people that don't actually fit with the thinking of the government, that may actually challenge some of the thinking of the government. Is that what the concern is? Mr Chair, I'd really like to have an answer from the Minister on that, Mr Chair. The other thing is, with regards to the legislation, is the time frame that's been put around these boards.